All right, it's time for a Tanya Summary Shiur, and not this week, but this part we're doing chapter 4 of Tanya Summary. It is probably one of the most requested shiurim, something that a lot of people have had a hard time following with. People have commented to me, both that listen to the shiur and that don't necessarily listen to the shiur, that it's very hard to follow what's going on. And so without further ado, let's get into it. I will just say it wasn't easy to prepare this shiur. I put a lot more effort into preparing it, simply because to take everything that's in this chapter and to boil it down is just very difficult. But ultimately, I think I got it to something manageable. And as we mentioned in previous shiurim, at least the last couple of shiurim, we're doing chapters of Tanya Summary piecewise instead of doing it necessarily how it's divided by the week, because in order to enable the consumption, it's a little bit more difficult when you would stop in the middle of a chapter. Anyhow, I digress, and without further ado, let us begin. So you have a general premise in the parak, which is that it says in Pri Eitz Chaim that the avodah of nowadays is primarily with davening. And that is to say that the main avodah of birurim, the main refinement of the world, is davening. And this is in contrast to the idea that studying Torah is notably higher than davening. What the Alter is referring to when he says that Talmud Torah is notably higher than davening, there's a chance that he's referring to the halacha that a person that studies Torah is actually a potter from davening if they're studying Torah full time. But regardless, so we say, I'm going to try to divide it up into different points that the Alter seems to ping pong back on each other, but we're going to discuss the advantages of Torah, mitzvahs, and davening. So the Alter says that Torah and mitzvahs are to draw divine investments into the world, and this is because we do mitzvahs with the world. Torah is describing the mitzvahs that we do with the world. So when we do Torah and mitzvahs, we ultimately end up drawing down divine investment that Hashem cares about the world and how it should function. So we end up drawing that down into the world. I will note there's a lot of Kabbalistic jargon already that's being skipped over. Again, this is a summary shiur, not an in-depth shiur. So the Alter says this is to a certain contrast with davening, even though davening is arguably a mitzvah say, at least the Rabbanon, for sure, it's some kind of a mitzvah. But the main point of davening is to be able to interact with Hashem. It's where we're interacting with Hashem when we daven. When we have Torah and mitzvahs, the Alter says, the interaction with Hashem isn't so apparent because it takes the medium of whatever the Torah and mitzvahs are about. Let's say you have an esrog, is an example that Alter goes with throughout the chapter in general. So you have an esrog. So a person shakes an esrog and they connect Hashem via the esrog. Also, Hashem creates the esrog. I mean, really, that's the first step. Hashem creates the esrog. And is the esrog a holy thing? The esrog isn't a holy thing. There is a notion that once a person takes it on Yom Tiv, it becomes hooked on l'svasei. That's the Rabbanon, analogous to the schach, but the schach is more arguably deraisa. But this isn't a halacha shiur. But ultimately, the esrog isn't in and of itself. It's not a neshama. It's a fruit. At the end of the day, it's a fruit. It might be overcharged for it, but it's a fruit nonetheless. Hashem invests himself in the fruit, and when a person picks up the esrog in order to do the mitzvah, it goes as in the seder of the shalshalos, as it were. I mean, in a literal sense, the whole shalshalos builds up until you have an esrog. Then a person uses that esrog to make divinity. But ultimately, there's a middleman in the connection point. But davening is you directly addressing Hashem. Even though, as far as the mitzvah goes, you have the physical lips, and you move your physical lips, and that's how you connect to Hashem. So really, was it your essence that's connecting to Hashem? No, it was the physical body. You can make all of those claims, but the essence of davening is the actual referring to Hashem. You say that Hashem is the one that heals the sick, and so when you daven that a sick person should be healed, you're not asking with the medium of the sick person to connect to Hashem. You're saying, healer of the sick, please heal the sick. So just to summarize where we're at briefly, Torah and mitzvahs is a connection to Hashem, but it requires an investment in a middleman. And davening is directly reaching out to Hashem. But with that being said, there's actually an advantage in Torah and mitzvahs. Torah and mitzvahs have a very deep investment of godliness. Moshe Rabbeinu, who I would say is probably one of the top people in Torah, but he wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael to do mitzvahs. There's a lot of mitzvahs that you could only do in Eretz Yisrael: Shemitah, Yevles, Leket, Shechicha, Peah, Truma, Meiser. All of these things you can only do when you have actual land in Eretz Yisrael. And Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to go into Eretz Yisrael to be able to do these mitzvahs. It says that he wanted to go in. You think that he wanted to go in to eat from the fruit, to be satisfied from the goodness, as the Gemara says. But no, Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to go in to be able to do mitzvahs. And also there's a concept of mevatlin Talmud Torah for mitzvah veres. If you have a mitzvah that no one else can do, only you can do it, and it's sitting there, and you need to, notwithstanding what we said before about davening. Davening is technically, I guess you would say, one of the exceptions to the rule, but we say that you're mevatlin Talmud Torah for the performance of the mitzvah, because mitzvahs have a very deep investment. Really, that's in a sense taken away from Torah, because we said Torah and mitzvahs both have this. Torah we'll get to later, as Hashem. But mitzvahs have a very deep investment of godliness. And in terms of the deep connection to Hashem, mitzvahs are really where it's at. Because there's a notion that in order for things to go lower, in order for things to descend lower, it needs to have a stronger connection to godliness. It needs to have a stronger investment of godliness. And the reason for this, more than just saying it axiomatically, that if it goes lower, it must have some kind of higher source, is because, in a practical sense, the mind isn't able to grasp Hashem. Practically speaking, however much Torah you learn, however much understanding you get, however much nevuah there might be, ultimately the mind, it just works in a different sense. We discussed this actually in the shiurim about the four worlds to some extent, but the mind is not adept at grasping things which are completely beyond the mind. Ultimately, the lower that things go, the easier it is to actually connect to some extent, because physical action is exactly what it is. It's just physical action. There's no deeper understanding. It's not such a complicated cheshbon. Ultimately, you can grasp godliness in a much greater sense, not in a much more personal sense. Torah is more personal. We'll get to that later, as Hashem. But ultimately, with a mitzvah, you do a physical action, and Hashem is invested in the physical action, and there's no complicated cheshbonis one way or another. There's no deep calculations to be had. Ultimately, that is the deepest way to connect to Hashem. When we live out exactly what Hashem wants from us, whether we understand it or not, that is the deepest connection we could have to Hashem. But then, there's also something to be said for Torah, that when we learn Torah about a mitzvah, even though it's not as great as actually living the script that Hashem has for us, we don't get so close to the divinity that's within the mitzvah per se. But as far as we go on a personal level, in our personal appreciation, Torah has that very great advantage. That as a person we understand and we cleave to Hashem, not to the fullest extent as we can with a mitzvah, but to the fullest extent that we as humans could possibly manage, that we do with Torah. Is that a lot? Maybe yeah, maybe no. I don't know. I can't possibly fathom how deep there is to go. But as far as the personal connection to Hashem, not talking about how close you get to actually living out Hashem's plan, but as far as the personal connection, yeah, learning Torah is the way to go. This is completely notwithstanding the point that Torah is also a mitzvah, that when you move your lips and you speak words of Torah, that is also the fulfillment of a mitzvah. We're talking simply about the platonic ideal of learning Torah as it is divested from being a mitzvah. So just to kind of summarize those points, doing a mitzvah is living out Hashem's plan for the world, whether we understand it or not. Ultimately, it is the deepest way of connecting to Hashem, although it's not as personal as Torah. Torah is a way of personally connecting to Hashem, even though it might not have such a deep investment of godliness, or not as deep of an investment as a mitzvah, but ultimately it is still deep investment of godliness, and it affects on a personal level. And to a certain extent, you have as a middle ground, you have moving your lips to study Torah, which has the advantage that it's a mitzvah. It also has the understanding that comes with it. So now that we're here, something that we should have been asking a while ago in theory, but we're getting to it now, so better late than never, is how could you take something that's not tefillin? Tefillin, I understand. The Sefer sat down, he wrote down Hashem's name, was Makadosh it, and so maybe to some extent the name of Hashem, the ink that's written on the cloth, maybe you would say, is now something that's a conduit for godliness. But how could you take something, let's say an esrog? You buy it in the store. How could the esrog not necessarily hook for the mitzvah? When you use an esrog for the first time on Sukkot, it's not necessarily hooked for the mitzvah, especially if you have another esrog sitting in the house. You could technically pick whichever one, so you're able to eat one of them. So it's not that it's specifically set aside for the mitzvah. But then a person picks up that esrog on Sukkot, and by the act of picking it up, they've connected to Hashem. How could you have a fruit that grew somewhere in Italy, and that's now a conduit for drawing down godliness? We've been talking this whole time about this notion that you do a mitzvah, and somehow by shaking the esrog, you're playing out Hashem's divine will, and so that enables you to connect to Hashem. But we said also before, you have a middleman of the esrog is the middleman. Hashem creates the esrog, the whole Seder Shalshos gets pumped into the esrog, and then the esrog is physical, and then you are physical, you interact with the esrog, and then you're able to make something spiritual with it. But how exactly does this work? How are you able to use a physical object to draw down godliness? So the Alter Rebbe says that the mashal for this is like a seed that's planted in the ground. The ground has the theoretical potential to grow whatever kind of fruit you might even fathom. Whether we fathomed it or not, I'm sure the scientists are working on it, genetically modifying, but ultimately, whatever it is, the ground has everything that's needed. The ground, you would say also the sunlight to provide the energy, the carbon dioxide to feed the plant, the carbon, at least to some extent. You have nitrogen in the ground. Ultimately, the entire setup is there, and it's able to grow plants. The seed isn't material that the ground needs. It's the instructions. It's the information, in a sense, that's passed down into the ground. And when the ground reads the DNA of the seed, it's able to make a whole tree that's able to grow children of the seed. So when you plant a seed in the ground, you're awakening the potential for growth that exists within the ground. And it's the same thing with doing a mitzvah. When you do a mitzvah with an esrog, it's not that the esrog is just some completely unrelated thing. No. The esrog is like a seed that it awakens the entire spiritual chain of shalshalos that exists behind the esrog. You can say the esrog is maybe more connected to it also. I'm not here to nitpick per se, but ultimately, what you're awakening is everything that's behind the esrog. Everything that's behind the esrog is awakened, and that has all of the potential for being a conduit for the divine, because everything that goes into the esrog, of the making of the esrog, is a conduit for the divine. That's exactly what's standing behind every single esrog. Every single apple on the shelf is something that the sweetness comes from chesed of Atzilos. So when we do a mitzvah, it's not that you have some physical esrog and it's somehow completely unrelated to spirituality. No, the esrog is very related to spirituality the whole time, and it's the conduit. It itself is, the conduit. It's the catalyst for awakening the latent, if you would say, latent spiritual or divine power that exists behind it. Now, in terms of actually drawing down godliness, this is a good explanation for mitzvah saseh, which, to be fair, is the question that we asked about how a mitzvah saseh can draw down godliness. But in general, it would also serve us well to understand how all kinds of divinity are able to be drawn down. We know that there is divinity that's drawn down with mitzvahs. As you mentioned before, the whole concept of doing mitzvah is a very direct connection to Hashem, a very deep investment of a connection to Hashem, I should say. And this idea only really works with mitzvah saseh, because you're doing something, so you pick up an esrog, the esrog has its spiritual sources, and when you do that, you're drawing down divinity. Loisa says, how exactly does that work? Hashem says not to do something, so you sit on your couch. Is your couch the thing that's drawing down the divinity? Is that what it is? And also, particularly, there are some mitzvahs Loisa say that we say haven't really happened, aren't really going to happen. Let's say pigul, for example, that a kohen should have a very specific kind of thought. It can't be too bad. It can't be good. He needs to have a very specific kind of wrong thought while he's bringing a carbon, or maybe a wrong speech, depending on which rishonim you hold. Ultimately, pigul is an extremely rare scenario, and I don't know that it's ever even happened. So how do you connect to Hashem through pickle? Pickle is an avera, but how do you connect to Hashem through pickle? So, to explain this, the Alter Rebbe says that there's an advantage in Torah. There's an investment of Hashem's wisdom, or of supernal wisdom, I should say. To say Hashem's wisdom is a complicated subject, the Rambam, and the scheme of Chachmei Kabbalah, etc., etc. But ultimately, there is an investment of higher wisdom, supernal wisdom, in the details of halachis. Now, in terms of actually being able to connect to whatever mitzvah it is, this has a very distinct advantage, which is that wisdom is kind of a level playing field. It is what it is. That is in contrast to, let's say, midos, for example, emotions. That when you connect with emotions, there's a lot of discrepancy with different people and different emotions, how people feel and interact. That's only talking about in a personal, I should say, interpersonal reaction. You have that distinction. But when a person relates to Hashem, let's say, with emotions, even though it's a very powerful thing, and there's actually a notion that with emotions you're able to connect in an even deeper way to Hashem. With that being said, it's more static. It doesn't have just the simple, this is what it is, that you have with wisdom. Wisdom it just preaches for itself. It stands for itself. There's no complications that go into it. I mean, it could be a complicated wisdom, but ultimately, again, it is what it is. I feel like I keep on saying it is what it is, so it is what it is. But when a person, let's say they love Hashem, right? So they say, I love Hashem. In that statement, you also have I, which is I love Hashem. And you can't have the emotion of love without the I. It's not that you're just in the statement, you try to cut the I out of the statement. It's not possible to have love without the notion of I. So then you need to get into what does it mean to love for this person? How does it relate to them personally? Because their love is a personal thing, and I'm sure that if they sit down with a good therapist, they could come to all kinds of ideas about how they formulate their love and why they form the relationships that they do, etc., etc. Ultimately, though, it's caught up in them being them. It has what to do with them personally. Even more so when you have, let's say, a physical mitzvah. You have an esrog. Okay, is the esrog the right size? Is it the right shape? Is it the right color? And does it have scratches or blisters? And is it whole? Is it complete? And all of these questions to be asked about an esrog, it's complicated details. And there's kavanah. There's a lot of things that go into it. And when all of that is said and done, ultimately you have an esrog. And the esrog is there, and it's its own entity. When you pick up the esrog, do you think that you're connecting to the divine? Maybe you think it. Do you see it? Not really. Maybe some great tzaddik can see it to a greater extent than I can, and I can appreciate that I'm connecting to the divine. But ultimately, there's a whole esrog in the way. It's a medium. It's it's a middleman between me and Hashem. And it's the same thing with emotion. That there's my own interaction with myself that will get in the way of every emotion that I have. But intellect is higher than that. It's simply just the facts on the table. Notwithstanding the point that I need to understand the facts, and notwithstanding the point that Hashem invested His supernal wisdom in the facts. But ultimately, it's just the facts on the table. You see clearly this is Hashem's wisdom. And that's it. It doesn't go beyond that. It doesn't matter who's the one thinking the wisdom. Wisdom is going to be the same. 2 + 2 = 4 is going to be the same, whether it's a computer that knows it. That's a complicated thing, so just scratch that from the record. Whether it's person A that thinks it, whether it's person B that thinks it, or whether it's Hashem that thinks it. Ultimately, the wisdom is the same wisdom, no matter what. For Hashem, He invested within it, and He created it. Sure. At the end of the day, though, wisdom is wisdom, and it goes beyond all of these boundaries. Okay, we're gonna try to keep it a little bit shorter, even though I had a feeling this would be a long one. But yeah, now just to kind of get more to the point to some extent, there are 2 more essential points that I want to bring out, and then we're gonna try to do a little bit of Hashlama. So the Alter Rebbe has a very decently sized arichos about neshamas and malachim with a lot of Kabbalistic terms, but the general gist of it is that neshamas are conduits for the descent of divinity. We bring down the divine into the world, and malachim are things that we create down here, kind of, so that they should go up, and they should rise up, and they should bring things up. There are other kinds of malachim. To make any statement about malachim in general is probably going to be a generalization of some form, but that's the general gist of the functions that things that we do. Neshamas are for bringing divinity down, and Malachim are for raising the divinity upwards. So now that we're here, the Alter Rebbe throws in kind of a comment. And this is why Rashbi and his generation learned Torah mainly. That was their avodah, and they wanted to draw down godliness, which is the ultimate goal of Seder Shalshalos, is to be able to draw down godliness into the world. Okay, this is the end of chapter 4 of Chutzes Achron, and anyone that was really paying attention through 20 minutes might be scratching their heads and wondering, wait a second, what happened to the original question that we asked of why it is that nowadays the avodah of davening is the main way of refining the world, whereas back in the day it used to be Torah. And I don't think Alter Rebbe outrightly answers this question over here. But that being said, I think he gave us the tools to figure it out. He does finish off with, this is enough for one that understands. I don't know if there was more to this that got cut out, and there was a more complete explanation. Very often the phrase, this is enough for someone that understands, is something that's said in the middle of a work. It's not like it's the way that you end off, like, I've given you all the pieces. But that being said, it could have been what he meant. Regardless, I think I'll just briefly tie everything together, maybe as I see, and any critiques, I guess, are welcome. But I think that what he's saying, ultimately, is that you have all different ways of connecting to Hashem. Mitzvahs are the deepest one, but mitzvahs are inherently going to be lacking a certain quality that you can only get with Torah, which is that mitzvahs are ultimately going to be some kind of interposition, whereas Torah is a very direct way of connecting to Hashem. Now, it's a different kind of directness relative to davening. The directness of Torah is that it's unchanging, and it's going to be the same medium regardless, but at the end of the day, it still is a medium. Davening is directly reaching out to Hashem, it's reaching upwards. Torah works just like a mitzvah. It's lacking a certain element that the mitzvah has, which is that when you do a mitzvah, ultimately you're triggering the entire spiritual source behind that mitzvah, but ultimately Torah has an advantage that, firstly, not every mitzvah can you actually accomplish in a physical sense to do this. You need to have Torah for that. And also, the personal connection that you get with Torah is much greater. So, to this end, originally, the avodah was that we need to draw down divinity into the world. And how do you draw down divinity into the world? You do this through Torah. This is how you refine sparks of holiness. With that being said, other points that the Alter Rebbe scattered throughout the chapter about how davening works is ultimately that davening, you're reaching upwards, and you connect directly to Hashem through that. But not only that, when you daven, you are taka creating malachim to elevate divinity. So I think what the Alter Rebbe is saying is that ultimately we daven in our avodah now because we've already refined the world to such an extent that we can start sending things back upwards, and we send things back upwards when we daven. So maybe there's more to be elaborated on, but ultimately, I think that's the gist of the chapter in summary. And I don't want to take any more time. So, Tzlach Rabba, and Rez Hashem, looking forward to next time, getting close to the end.